Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orthodoxy. My name is Andy Schmidt, and I'm back with another podcast. I got to talk with Leah Savas here in this episode. We talked about abortion, and she is the life beat reporter for World Magazine or World News. Some of you might know about World News. I've had a couple of other reporters from the World News, but she's focused specifically on abortion and different legal matters happening across the country related to abortion. And so we talked about the election during the last election. Presidential election. There was a lot of other elections happening at the same time, Senate races, House races. There were also 10 different constitutional amendments across the country in 10 different states that were being voted on. The big one in Florida that was turned down, the one that would allow for abortions almost up to 9 months, that was turned down. But there was a multitude of others across the country in Missouri, in Montana, and 7 of the 10 were voted in favor of abortion, even in states that voted red, even if in states that were majority Republican, they actually voted in favor of abortion and actually putting these laws into the Constitution. And so we talked about the 7 of the 10 states. We talked about them. We talked about Missouri and how it was kind of an interesting state that was a big kind of a big upset that people didn't think in the pro-life camp did not think that Missouri was going to vote in favor of abortion, and they did. And so we talked about that. We talked about what is happening with the pro-life movement. It feels like after Roe was overturned, the pro-life movement kind of lost some momentum. It lost a vision. The vision for so long was to get Roe overturned, and then when it happened, felt like people didn't really have vision forward. And so we talked a little bit about that, what the future of the pro-life movement is going to look like, and then we did talk a bit about a book that she co-wrote with Marvin Olasky called The Story of Abortion in America, a street-level history from 1652 to 2022. This is one of the best books I've read in a long time, and it's a very brutal book to read. You have to kind of brace yourself as you go into reading this because it is just a street-level view of abortion and the history of abortion in North America for 400 years. And you go through court cases and you read through the journals of the abortionist, and you really come to learn that these abortionists, these people were bloodthirsty psychopaths. I mean, they really wanted to murder children. That's what they wanted to do. That's what they desired. And it's a difficult read, but I think for people in the modern age who are so passive and so have kind of turned their brains off to abortion and have just accepted it as just something that people do and haven't really taken the issue seriously. I think that this book is an absolute necessity to read. You should be reading this book, and you should have to face the horrors of abortion. Abortion is the greatest evil that, and abortion in America has been the greatest evil that any country in human history has ever engaged in. Produced more deaths, more infant deaths, more murder than any other thing in human history, any other war, any other law, any other mandate, any other thing in human history. So people who are not able to create moral distinctions in their mind, even especially Christians or so-called Christians who can't figure out whether or not abortion is evil or whether or not they should vote for people who want to murder children, who want to put laws into place that allow for the slaughter of infants and for the severing of infants' heads from their bodies and for the poisoning of infants. There's a lot of people, a lot of so-called Christians, a lot of fake Christians who pretend like they can't figure this out, and they vote for people who want to put these sorts of laws and things into place. I think that this is a must-read book. And so The Story of Abortion in America, we talked about it. We did talk about how even the so-called conservative Republican Party is sliding left on the abortion issue, but certainly not as left as the Democrat Party in America, as the liberals who want full-on 9-month abortions. They want to have botched abortions. They want to take those babies and they still want to kill them. And we talked about this a little bit in this podcast as well, that in Minnesota, if there's a botched abortion, you can take the baby, put him in a room, lock him in the room, let him die. A live baby that's healthy, you can just let him die because the mother doesn't want them. And so we talked about all this stuff. We talked about the future of the abortion or the pro-life movement, the abortion abolitionist movement that's beginning, the people who are wanting to put women in prison for having abortions, put the abortionists in prison for doing the abortions. And so we talked about all of these things. It was a wide-ranging conversation, a very good conversation. And then we kind of want to follow it up at some point with another conversation where we can kind of discuss even further what the future of this movement looks like, the pro-life movement, because it seems like it's losing momentum across the country. That said, I hope you enjoyed this episode. But before we get into it, I just want to talk about the sponsor, Rocket Sled Studios. I talked about this in the last episode, but I've been working with Rocket Sled Studios for about 2 years or so, a year and a half, 2 years. And we are creating a children's animated TV show based on a book series from the 1980s by David and Karen Maines called The Tales of the Kingdom, kind of a Christian fantasy series in the same vein as Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings. And we have, we've gotten the rights to pursue funding and to pursue production and try to build out this children's animated series. And so we're super excited. And I want to show you a little promo video that we put together. So you can watch it right here.
Imagine you've had a long, hard day and nothing sounds better than planting yourself in front of the TV. But then your children or your grandchildren walk in and they want to watch too. What would you turn on? Actually answer that question. What TV show or movie would you feel good about watching together? Allow me to dig a bit deeper. How much influence do you think these screens will have on this generation? I'm not saying this device is evil. It can be, but it's also an opportunity. This is where the eyeballs are today. And if the body of Christ doesn't reach them here, then we don't exist to them. The real question is, how do you reach a generation that doesn't always seem like they want to hear the truth? The answer? Story. There's a saying that he who tells the stories shapes the culture. And I believe that so much of the lostness and confusion that we experience every day in our culture is because of the stories that we consume. Imagine if we could promote stories that talked about goodness and truth and beauty. That is what Tales of the Kingdom is all about. And now, on its 40th anniversary, we intend to transform those beloved best-selling books into an animated series. We have the stories, we've developed the artwork, and we've built the team necessary to bring this series to life. And with your help, we can have the first episode here in as little as 1 year, and the rest won't be far behind. Storytelling is the key to capturing hearts and minds. And I am convinced that there is no greater investment that we can make in the next generation. So I want to genuinely ask you, what are you investing in today that will directly impact your children, your grandchildren, and the whole generation that they're part of, including kids around the world who've never even heard the story of God? This animated series is an investment that will shape and mold your children into the men and women you prayed they would become. Consider investing in Tales of the Kingdom today, and we will gladly include your name as a producer in the credits that your kids can point to for years to come. Thank you, and God bless.
All right, so that was the Tales of the Kingdom ad for this episode. If you want to know more information about Tales of the Kingdom and about Rocket Sled Studios, you can go to www.rocketsledstudios.com and check it out. Other than that, I really hope you enjoy this episode. All right. Well, I'm here with Leah Savas. Is that how you say your last name? I should have asked you before we started. Yeah. Okay, Savas. Okay, great. And obviously gave the introduction to who you are, but you've been kind of following and reporting on some of the abortion things around the country over the past, for a while now. And obviously we're coming off of this election where Trump just won and everybody's a little bit confused. I'm super confused what in the world happened. Of course I wanted Trump to win, but how did that actually happen? So my first question for you, I guess, is kind of twofold. One is, as you were reporting on and doing the research on different states and these sort of different amendments and different, sort of people are voting on different things related to abortion across the country. What were you finding leading up to the election, and what were your predictions for the election. And then now that the election has actually happened, are you surprised? Are you just like, no, this is exactly what I thought was going to happen?
So when it comes to the abortion amendments, I am not very surprised on how that went. So for people who don't know, there were 10 states that voted on abortion-related ballot measures. Nebraska actually had 2 abortion measures on the ballot. So basically voters got to pick. Technically, I think you could have voted for both. I'm not sure if anyone did that. But anyway, so that was the only state with 2. But there were 9 additional states with 1 on their ballots. And going into election day, I was seeing the polls and it looked like several of them, like most of them were polling that they would pass. And of course, like these are states like New York, Maryland, Colorado, like we can kind of expect that a pro-abortion measure would pass there. Right. But there was also polling suggesting that one in Missouri would pass, which Missouri currently has protections for babies all the way through pregnancy. So that was kind of scary going into election day. And also in Florida, they have a higher threshold for what percentage of votes an amendment needs in order to actually pass. A ballot measure needs to be added to the state constitution. And it was showing that, they weren't meeting the 60% threshold. But they were still past 50% in some of the polls. So anyway, going into election day, I was like, I'm pretty sure we're going to see some of these pro-abortion measures pass. And these are like constitutional amendments. These are not just statutes. These are in the state constitutions. And 7 of them passed. So that included, what was that?
Out of 10.
7 out of 10 passed. So that included the one in Missouri, which I think that was the most devastating one for the pro-life movement, given that Missouri is the only state at this point that has passed a right to abortion in its state constitution while having a total protection for babies throughout pregnancy. I mean, there are exceptions for like medical emergencies and stuff. But yeah, so even Ohio last year passed a very similar amendment, but they didn't currently have their heartbeat law in effect. So it wasn't quite the shift that we're going to see in Missouri. Before Roe v. Wade was overturned, Missouri had basically 1 abortion facility left that only rarely actually performed abortions, if I remember correctly. So they were already a very pro-life state even before Dobbs, but now we're going to probably see it go in the opposite direction, where now Missouri is like one of the most southernmost states that will have legal abortion through basically until viability for any reason, and after that for broad health exceptions. So it's going to really change. It's going to really change what things are like in Missouri. But I guess, sorry, I got too focused on Missouri there.
No, you're good. Well, it's a real quick, like that. Was Missouri the one? So I read your article this morning. I'll put the link in the description for people. But was Missouri the one, or were there a couple of them that kind of made the language seem like, okay, if you have like certain mental health problems, what is that?
I believe Missouri was one of them that explicitly says there's exceptions for life and physical or mental health. There were a couple of those. Other ones will just say life or health, which still you can interpret health to include mental health, which that's very broad. And we know from the Doe v. Bolton decision from 1973, and that's like the companion case to Roe v. Wade. From that decision, the Supreme Court interpreted health to include mental health and anything kind of like familial or social, or I think they even mentioned like finances, just very, you can basically interpret that however you want, to be abortion for basically any reason. Like I'm stressed or, like
that's insane.
My finances, I don't have the finances to have another child. So that health exception, even though, pro-abortion groups will say, oh, it's just for the life or health. Like we're, when you actually interpret the language, courts can take it any which way they want, really.
Well, and as somebody, my wife and I have 2 kids. and we were, I don't know how old, like 22, 23 when we had our first one. We've had like 2 kids in 2 years. So I'm only 25. And so we've been fruitful.
Yes.
But she, like, from my understanding, like when we found out that, we were pregnant with Titus, our first one, she was stressed a little bit. And like, I mean, I feel like most women are, especially new mothers or somebody who's been pregnant for the first time. You're like, what in the world is this going to be like? My body's going to change.
Exactly.
There's going to be stress. And from those statistics that we know, a lot of women who have abortions, they end up later on regretting it. Mm-hmm. And because there's so many things like happening in a woman's mind and body when they get pregnant, that stress and fear, probably that's an easy way, even for women who are married. And my wife is a Christian and has, you know, there's just stress. So those sorts of decisions are, I guess, this sort of manipulation around the language or the broad ambiguity around the language.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's like incredibly important. Yeah. And it's important that like people know that those words actually really have no meaning. Basically what that means, you would say, right, that under almost any circumstance, people can just kind of have an abortion.
Yeah. Functionally, I think that's the concern for pro-life groups, is that functionally it is allowing for abortion for any reason. Now, interestingly, I was doing some reporting on this several months ago, but there were actually groups in Missouri that were butting heads about what language to push to get on this ballot measure for this pro-abortion constitutional amendment. Some groups wanted it to be just a blanket, you know, you have a right to abortion. They didn't want any mention of viability, which this amendment that passed did mention. You know, you have the government can't interfere with your right to abortion basically until viability, and then afterwards for these, you know, life and health exceptions. But some of the pro-abortion groups wanted something that was just like, no, you just have a right to abortion. We have no mention of any sort of limit or anything like that. Because the concern for these pro-abortion groups is that the pro-life side will take any sort of little concession in a pro-abortion amendment to say, oh, well, we're going to pass this protection for babies. We're going to restrict it in this way. So it's almost like both sides, they're kind of suspicious of the other side, kind of taking language and stretching it to fit their own goals. So it will be interesting to see, what do pro-life groups do in Missouri now? I'm not sure exactly what their plans are, but that would be interesting to just watch and see, are there things that they can still do to protect unborn babies in the state? Or, you know, are they going to have to focus on helping pregnancy centers and funding for young moms, stuff like that? We'll just have to see what the new reality is for them moving forward. Yeah.
Well, for people who don't know, can you explain what viability is?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, so viability is the point in pregnancy when most children could survive if they're born early. So that used to be 28 weeks, but within the past, I guess, couple decades, I'm not really sure when this changed. As long as I've been paying attention to it, it's been 24 weeks, but it used to be 28. And then I've even seen people describe viability as even earlier. So there are babies as early as 21 weeks in pregnancy that have survived after being born prematurely. So technically, viability, it really depends on the technology you have available. And it's getting earlier and earlier in pregnancy, the more advanced medicine is. So that's why some laws will say you can abort a baby until they're capable of surviving outside of the womb. That's kind of like the general. A lot of these amendments actually use that language, but then they, like we talked about before, they have those broad health exceptions after the fact, after that, that limit. So
So apparently, I mean, viability, that is the most ridiculous thing I think I've ever, like the idea that the argument it seems like they're making is the baby becomes a human being as soon as it can not rely on the mother in some capacity. Although, I mean, we have a 1-year-old right now who's still, or she's like 9 months old right now. She still is, look, if we just left her in her bedroom, she'd die. I mean, that's like, so is that what they are trying to say, is that viability means in some capacity that baby is a human being? I don't know where the logic is. Explain the logic.
I think they're saying that the state like a state government or any government might have an interest in protecting that baby's life at that point, because then the baby is more likely to be,
Okay.
not be born as a stillbirth or miscarried. So, I mean, I remember, so I have a 4-month-old, and when we hit that 21 week mark, I was like, okay, now if he comes early, we might have a chance. There's always that concern of like a miscarriage before that point. So it kind of changes the game once a baby gets farther along in the pregnancy, but to use that cutoff as a point where you can kill a baby before that, but not after that. Yeah. I mean, they're just as, like you were saying, they're just as reliant on help, as a baby that's 6 weeks. So
right. So there's a ton of philosophical inconsistencies and things that don't make sense. I've tried to think through the abortion thing, and I just don't understand. I mean, some people try to make it a scientific argument. They're like, well, when the baby, the heartbeat means that something is alive. And you're like, yeah, except for like a plant or a tree, like they don't have heartbeats and they're alive. And then you have you have all these different kind of scientific arguments, but I think it ultimately it's not a scientific conversation. It's a philosophical, or even it's a theological conversation.
Yes. I think it's ultimately a theological conversation, because I feel it seems to me that, if someone thinks that they are the most important thing in their own life, if they're the source of truth or, the standard of right and wrong, they're going to find any reason to get an abortion, and that's going to be good to them because that's what is best for them. That's like the, self-help sort of mentality. But if you believe that you're accountable to a higher, authority, namely God, then that's going to be the thing that prevents you from just acting in your own interest. So we can make all these scientific arguments we want, but I think people know that babies, largely, I think people know that unborn babies are living. I think moms who get abortions, sometimes they might not know, but I think more often than not, a lot of these moms that get abortions already have other kids. So they know something. They know that this is a life. So but it's just them choosing to do what they see as best in their own eyes instead of what the Lord sees as right. So
absolutely. And actually they don't. And actually the scientists actually know this as well. There's actually not science happening, if we're talking about, what does it mean to be alive, that, like I said, a tree is growing without a heartbeat. A tree is growing without a brain. And so there are things in this world that grow that are alive that don't have a heartbeat, a brain, things like that. And so it never really was and this is the thing that people get frustrated sometimes I think when I say this, but I don't think it was ever a conversation of what does it mean to be alive or not alive. I think it's a conversation of, I think there's debate on, can I murder people or not? Can I get rid of people that are inconvenient to me? And we're going to start with the baby, but I definitely believe that over a period of time, we're already seeing 9-month or post-birth abortion laws like in Minnesota, and that's just going to keep going. I don't see how that's, somebody who disagrees with you politically, you can kill them if you're part of the correct regime. So I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I just think that that's kind of where that goes.
Well, so the book that Marvin Oleski and I wrote, he wrote anything before the 1990s. So he wrote most of the book, but I wrote the last portion. But in one of the parts that he wrote, he was sharing some of the history of doctors in America in the 1800s. And just from looking at their writings, the lectures that they would give, there were doctors even in the 1800s who knew that, or believed, and I would argue they knew from science that, and then, this is the 1800s. This is not like they have the advanced ultrasound technology that we have today. They did not have that. But even then they were giving lectures, writing materials, making the assertion that life begins at conception, and that
Yeah.
an unborn baby is just as much their patient as the mother that comes to them that is pregnant. So
Yeah.
this has been, and that's one of the things that Marvin, my co-author, he was kind of the one that initiated working on this book. So one of his goals was, we want to debunk some of the assertions, the false assumptions that people have about abortion in early America, including the fact that there was no consensus among doctors about when life begins. Well, no, there was a consensus, at least among these doctors in the 1800s, that life began at conception. And the doctors that even were okay with abortion didn't argue for abortion so much as, oh, well, that baby isn't actually alive, as it was, I think this is a socially appropriate decision for this mom to make, given the fact that she is single or, has a disability. That's how they made the judgment. It wasn't based on, well, I don't think this child is, I don't think this fetus or embryo is not alive.
Yeah. I mean, I have the book right here, and it's an amazing book, and it's very, very difficult to read in certain parts. But the thing that I recognize as I'm reading through it is basically every single talking point from the left and from the pro-abortion people it's all a lie. It's all revisionist history. I mean, they tell you that, like you're saying, that there's never been consensus in, the modern world or even 200 years ago, that like people just don't know when life starts, and nobody ever knew. And actually, like, abortions happen more when you outlaw it and things like that. And I mean, we could talk about the statistics today, but it seems like in the book, like this wasn't necessarily, like, in the 1650s, this wasn't really a common occurrence. Am I right about that?
Yeah. So there were abortions happening definitely as early as the 1650s, but it certainly wasn't as common as today. And part of that was because of the way communities were set up. There was more like accountability from people in the community around them. So, like, one of the first stories Marvin writes about in the book is about this servant girl who's impregnated by her master, and he forces an abortifacient on her, forces her to eat like this poached egg with these herbs, that will cause an abortion. And you would think if the narrative from Roe v. Wade, from that very opinion, was true, that would be okay, it's okay that he did that. But they actually put him on trial for murder because that baby died. And so they saw that baby as being a person. He didn't get convicted because there was a lack of evidence to really connect his action with the baby's death. Just seeing that story, and I guess more specifically, like the Roe v. Wade decision, there was this idea that before quickening, it was okay to have an abortion. Now, quickening is like roughly 5 months when the mother can actually feel the baby moving inside of her. But there's an even more specific story where a midwife testified to how old the baby actually was that was aborted. And this was another forced abortion in kind of the same community as this other one I was just telling you about. But basically, the midwife testified that the baby was, it was early enough in the pregnancy that that would not have applied, but still that man went on trial for murder as well for forcing that abortion on the woman. So we see just an inconsistency there with the actual historical records between those records and the assertions in the Roe v. Wade decision. So that's kind of one of the big goals, was to show what's wrong with these arguments that we're seeing and what the history actually says.
Well, it says it's a street level history, and that's the big thing. There is a difference historically between the like elites in ivory towers and the universities, or the people who are kind of the mouthpiece for certain philosophies. They will. Certain historians, actually a lot of historians, will just say that history is kind of told by these people who are the elites in every society historically. And I mean, this book, like, you're just like quoting random people that nobody's ever heard of, really, who are the actual women or the people who are actually doing the abortions. And there's not, like you're saying, there's not always actually a connection between the sort of high level pro-abortion philosophies and actually what's happening on the legal level or on the street level, where women are being taken advantage of and are being murdered in certain cases, even the women and the child. And when you read through it, I mean, it's like, there are times where I like stop reading it. I was like, this is so intense to hear these stories about these women. But the thing that was, I mean, it gets worse as you read it, because people, I think, are becoming in society more, I don't want to like be, well, I think they are becoming more evil in a lot of ways. And there's more technologies that allow for a lot more evil to be had and people do evil technologically in secret ways. But you did have a moral kind of fabric in the early years, in the 1600s, even 1700s. There was sort of just Christians and people were like, this is ridiculous. This is murder. You shouldn't do this. Nowadays, even in churches, I don't even know if you could, I don't know are there statistics on whether or not people in churches think that abortion is wrong? I mean, I know in Madison, it's like a moral conundrum. People in Madison, which is not the rest of the country, but churches in Madison, Christians, they can't figure it out. It's like a very difficult thing to figure out whether or not abortion is wrong. It's like, I don't even know how you could get to that point. But all that to say, so there was a strategic reason why you wrote this book from the street level perspective. And that was just to say that there's a big difference between what's being said at the high levels and actually what's happening at the low levels, right?
Well, and also to show that abortion is not just like a political issue. Yeah. It's not a philosophical. I mean, it is partially. It's partially political. It's partially philosophical. But at the most fundamental thing is it affects people's lives. You know, it affects the lives of women who have abortions. It affects the lives of the babies that are aborted. And those two characters specifically, we didn't want to, we wanted to tell the story in a way that brought them into the story, you know, and showed how abortion actually affects these two groups of people. But of course, you know, it affects communities. It affects the people who perform the abortions. It affects people who are fighting against pro-abortion laws, people who are fighting for pro-abortion laws. So we just wanted to show that it also, another thing is that showing how really the everyday decisions people make. I don't know if you've heard the politics is downstream from culture, like that. That's a big like tagline at the Colson Center. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but that's essentially what we're showing in the book as well, that these everyday decisions of everyday people does kind of trickle down into influencing public opinion and influencing what the law actually is. So kind of showing how, you know, a top-down approach of just changing the laws without having people kind of be on board and have changed hearts, changed minds, it doesn't really work really well. So, and I'm not saying that, oh, if everyone's okay, you know, with such and such, we should automatically just not try to make it illegal. But we're kind of seeing that play out in some ways with the passage of all these pro-abortion amendments, where even though Roe v. Wade has been overturned and states are allowed to protect unborn life if they want, we're seeing a lot of voters just being okay with abortion. And I know pro-life groups will say that a lot of these amendments have passed because the pro-abortion side is just really well funded and they're spreading lies. And I don't argue with that. Like, they definitely do spread lies and spread inaccurate concerns about the laws, such as like women, you know, not being able to get life-saving care in emergencies. Like, you know, that's just not true. I mean, sure, maybe doctors are confused. Maybe there are some doctors who are confused, but that's not the fault of the law. That's the fault of people causing the confusion about the laws. Right. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, when you have voters, you know, they're weighing in on this abortion issue, and we can see from the results of these just this week, you know, the 10 abortion amendments, 7 of them passed. Well, I think a big part of that is people are just okay with abortion. And, if we have people, if these are the people electing our officials and casting votes on pro-abortion ballot measures, this is what we're going to end up with, So that's why we wanted to show that a political, how political abortion is now and what a big influence it is on the culture as a whole. Well, that starts with the everyday decisions of people and just what they think in their own minds. That's like the fundamental issue. So, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I've noticed that has a lot. I mean, obviously your political, what you're voting for is absolutely indicative of what you believe. And that's, people try to divorce that and say, theology is over here, philosophy is over here, economics is over here, law, they're all in different areas, and we can compartmentalize. And just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that you can be, it doesn't mean that you can't be a Democrat or, and I did a podcast, I think it was the last one I did. You probably maybe didn't see this, but I don't think that you can be a Christian anymore and be a Democrat. I don't think that it's justifiable at all in any way, shape, or form, mostly because of the abortion issue. But I think the trans stuff, and I think a lot of the policy that they put in place is anti-human at its core. But the idea that you can divorce your theological convictions as a Christian from the political sort of what you're voting for, I think that that's been coming from the pulpit for a long time in a lot of churches in America. And either coming from the pulpit explicitly, or pastors are just not talking about the issues. I didn't hear anything. Maybe I don't know where you live, but where I'm from, I have not heard anything about abortion from any pulpit my entire life. I've never heard any pastor talk about abortion and how it's evil. Maybe once, maybe I can't, but I don't know if I've ever heard that. And that's bizarre to me, because I think the Bible is clear about that. I think Jesus talks about things like that. So I don't know. Have you seen that? Have you done any research on the church in America, maybe evangelical churches in America specifically as it relates to abortion?
So we talk about that a little bit in our book. And I mean, interestingly enough, the Southern Baptist Convention used to have a relatively pro-abortion platform. I don't know if that's platform is the right word. They had they passed a resolution. I think it was in either the 70s or 80s. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of rough on the details here. That's fine. Basically they were affirming abortions under certain circumstances. And there you have writers in Christianity Today back in the 80s, even affirming abortion as right under certain circumstances. And it wasn't just life of the mother situation. It was more broad than that, although I don't remember the exact details. But after, that was kind of the starting point after Roe v. Wade for those particular, Christian groups here in the United States. Yeah. But eventually there were better convictions among evangelicals. I think Catholics have always had a very strong stance against abortion. They've been pretty consistent in that way, as far as I know for a fact that there are pro-abortion Catholics out there, but as far as the leadership, it's very much no, abortion is not acceptable. But evangelicals, not so much until after, I guess, I think Francis Schaeffer was a big part of kind of calling the church out on that and calling them out to okay, this is a major cultural issue. We need to take a biblical stance on this. So I think he was a big part of kind of waking up evangelicals to that issue. But like you're saying, I have heard of pastors who are avoid the abortion issue because they don't want to offend people in their congregation. They know there are lots of women who have had abortions that go to churches, So I think the thought is, I don't want to step on toes. I don't want to offend anyone. But my church does. It's not like my pastor gives sermons on abortion, but he talks about it. They pray about, abortion related political developments. We have a woman at our church who volunteers at a pregnancy center that before I came, I remember the pastor talking about how she actually came on stage and like kind of gave an update on what's going on at the pregnancy center, stuff like that. So like my church is not in this category, but I do know that there are pastors who are afraid to talk about it, which I think is dangerous because not only because it leaves people potentially confused or unsure about, what scripture actually says about abortion, but also because then what about the women who have had abortions in your congregation who need to hear that abortion is a sin, but B, because it's a sin, that means it's covered by the blood of Christ, just like any other sin. It's not like it's in its own category of evil. Like it's still forgivable. It's something that the Lord can forgive. And it's because of the sacrifice of Christ that we can be free from even that sin. So, so I think treating it as if it's, we don't want to talk about it because it's so sensitive. Well, would you do that with another sin? Like with the sin of pride? Would you do that with the sin of gluttony? Like, would you just avoid talking about those things because you don't want to offend people in your congregation? Like they need to hear the problem so that they can look to the solution in Christ, without thinking that, I'm in my own category of sinner,
Yeah. No, that's very good. I mean, I'm glad you're saying all that. I think you're absolutely right. I do think a lot of these pastors though would tell you that gluttony is too sensitive a sin. I think everything's become too sensitive a sin. And some of these pastors, nothing is, you're not allowed to talk about anything, on stage or I guess you're not allowed to preach on sin anymore. And it's a very frustrating thing. Yeah. And I'm watching it. I mean, I know I'm talking a lot about what's happening in Madison, but I'm just watching it happen. We were like I interviewed a lady the other day and she runs one of the biggest, women pregnancy centers in Madison. And it's called CareNet Pregnancy Center. She's a CEO. And she said that less than 10% of the giving for the pregnancy center comes from the churches in the city. So like the churches are not giving any money to this thing and pastors aren't talking about it. So nobody knows whether or not it's a sin. Mm-hmm. And I do think that pastors avoiding the issue isn't just like a kind of an avoidance and a problem. I think it's heresy and false teaching because Jesus commands in the Great Commission that we teach people to obey all that he commanded. So if we're not teaching people to obey all that he's commanded, we're not teaching them on the basis of what the scriptures say, and therefore you're a false teacher. I think you can draw logical, theological lines there. But you're lucky that you go to a church that does that, because I haven't been able to really find any around this part of the country. Do you find it that in different parts of the country, it seems to be worse or better? I mean, I know we're talking about out of the 10 states, really 7 of them kind of were pro-abortion. I was surprised to see like Montana in there. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but
no,
Montana's like country folk, like, I don't know, like people out there like riding horses. I would have thought that they would have been like, no, like abortion is wrong. What in the world happened in Montana?
Well, that's one thing I talked about in the article you mentioned. Many of these states that passed these pro-abortion measures also went red. They backed Trump in this election. And I think that shows essentially that the Republican Party is not the pro-life party,
Exactly.
It is, I would say it's closer to the safe, legal, and rare kind of mantra of the Democrats from a couple of decades ago. Like the Republicans have shifted in that direction. So just because someone is voting for Donald Trump, I think we can say for certain it doesn't mean that they're doing it for pro-life reasons or that they even really care about the abortion issue as far as like from a pro-life perspective. So, I think that should be concerning, I think, to pro-lifers and pro-life voters. It definitely, I did another article a couple months ago, just talking with some voters, like just everyday, people who maybe would say they're a single issue voter, or at least see abortion as a top issue in how they cast their vote. And a lot of people had a very different perspective on how we're planning to approach this election. Some of them were like, it's the lesser of two evils situation. I know Kamala Harris would be gung ho for the abortion issue. The Democratic National Convention, it made headlines that there was like an abortion bust outside of the convention. And now that wasn't like paid for by the convention, but the fact that it attracted that sort of business, I think that tells you a lot about who the Democratic National Convention, what they stand for. So there are some people who are like, lesser of two evils. I need to vote for Trump. But then there are other people who and I don't know if you're familiar with Lila Rose. She's she's the president of Live Action, a very influential pro-life organization. And they're all over the internet. They've got like a really active YouTube channel. They have like a news site. They're very influential, but she had the mentality, and I don't know if she, more closer to the election, if she put out anything saying that she had changed her mind, or I don't know.
She did. She did. She said she was going to vote for Trump. Is that what you're talking about?
Oh, really? I missed that. Yeah. I did not see that, because when she originally, when Trump was making some very pro-abortion or pro-choice statement, she was like,
and Melania.
She originally, Lila Rose was like, we need to make him earn our vote. This is his chance to earn the pro-life vote. So that's interesting that she changed her mind. But I had talked to some other pro-lifers, just like, not people like Lila Rose who have a large organization that they're running, but just everyday pro-lifers who are like, no, I'm not voting for him. I mean, people I know personally too, like in my extended family, had this mentality of, I'm not going to vote for Trump because he is not representing my view on abortion, or, the biblical view of abortion. I just don't want to encourage that sort of platform. So I think people had very different perspectives on how they were going to approach this election when it came to giving a pro-life vote. So, I
had, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I don't remember exactly what your question was. So I'm sorry I rambled, but
no, that's fine. No, because I think this brings on an interesting conversation, because I was on the fence about Trump, especially with the abortion stuff. I was like, what are you doing? You were the most pro-life candidate ever. I mean, he helped overturn Roe. I think that's one of the most pro-life things you could do. I mean, in recent history. And now he's kind of just like, leave it to the states. I don't even want to talk about it. So that was annoying. But I did end up going for Trump, because I thought that, like, okay, the Democrat platform and belief system has become so immoral on so many different levels, on so many different issues. I mean, like the trans issue, like that's horrible. And especially for kids. I think in Minnesota, where Tim Walz governs, it's a sanctuary state, or maybe Minneapolis is a sanctuary city, in which if young kids, 15-year-old girls and boys, want to go over there and get themselves chopped up because they think that they're the opposite gender, they can do that. And so I think one of the issues, so I'm trying to work this out in like the last couple of days. And so I'll just say things that maybe will be inflammatory, and then we'll see what happens. But I have an issue with the people who are only voting on the basis of abortion for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that the pro-life movement, while it should be pro-life primarily for the unborn, because that is a major issue. And I don't think that you can really have a civil political society in which you don't take serious the dignity of the human person. And that comes down to the human person as the least of us, using the biblical thing that was manipulated by the Democrats, but the least of us, which is the innocent babies who are being murdered. That said, the pro-life movement should also broaden its horizons a little bit. Like, I think the Republican platform is pro-life in a multitude of ways. I think it's anti-war, which, I mean, there's been millions of people who have died in the last 4 years in global wars because of the lack of conviction by the Democratic Party as it relates to Ukraine and Israel. And so people have died in those ways. People have died because of the trans surgeries. People are dying because of people coming over the border and being killed and raped because 20 million people coming over the border. So I think I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about this. And I'm going to keep asking people because I don't exactly know where I stand. It does feel like the pro-life movement, for good reason, because we need to take care of the babies and we need to take care of those people who can't defend themselves, have really narrowed the scope. They're like, okay, we're gonna talk about babies, unborn babies, which is amazing, and I think it's good. I think now though the pro-life movement needs to make the argument for life as it relates to. I mean, we have such a degenerate society in which we think that we can cut children up and then murder babies. So like we have an issue. I think we just need to make the like broad general argument for life, like in general, and then kind of narrow it into the babies, because I don't think, like we're seeing in the election and the results that you reported on across those 10 states, I don't think that I don't think people think babies are humans, and that's a disgusting thing. But how are you actually going to get people to think that? I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that? I don't actually know if I might change my mind in a week.
So as far as like pro-life groups broadening their focus, I think that's been definitely an argument from critics of the pro-life movement, and specifically like pro-abortion groups. Well, like, shouldn't you be pro-life for the whole life? And, shouldn't you be focusing on these other, like, feeding children and, all the kids in foster care? And pro-lifers do care, they care about that. Yeah, but absolutely. When it comes to like an actual organization that's focused on ending abortion, I don't think, I don't know. I don't run one of those organizations. I'm not really a part of one. Like I write for a Christian organization, but we're not, we're not like a lobbying group or something. So, I think there is something to be said for focusing solely on the abortion issue. But it is interesting to me that you brought up the like transgenderism, quote unquote transgenderism issue, because that was actually the pro-life side. They made a lot of arguments in combating some of these amendments, specifically in Missouri, saying that adding this to the Constitution would not just open the door to abortion for any reason, but it would also open the door to children getting transgender procedures without their parents being involved or knowing about it because of the language. Like, because Missouri specifically was like a reproductive freedom amendment, which that's broader than just abortion. Although when people hear that, they probably think mainly abortion. Reproductive freedom, I mean anything having to do with reproduction. So if you, if you want this massive surgery to change your sex characteristics, wouldn't that fall under that? So that was an argument that pro-life groups were making, trying to warn people about this. And I don't know, maybe either they just weren't able to get their message out enough, which makes sense if you look at, the budget that the pro-abortion groups had as opposed to the budget for the pro-life groups. It's a massive difference. Like pro-life groups were outspent just massively by the pro-abortion groups. So that could be part of it, but maybe another part of it is people being apathetic about that too. I mean, it's certainly not as, I guess, as, at least from my perspective, and since I report on abortion, maybe my perspective is skewed, but it seems like the abortion issue has become way more like hot button, especially in this election cycle. And just a lot of people not really knowing what they think about it, given the stories of women in pro-life states having pregnancy complications and not being able to get help from doctors. Now pro-life groups would argue, well, that's because there's confusion about the laws. Like if the doctors actually read the laws, they should, they would feel comfortable intervening in these situations because we make exceptions for when the mother's life is at risk.
Sure.
but I don't think, people sometimes are just reading headlines. They don't actually read entire articles.
No,
so
they don't.
So if they had, if they're just reading a headline, they're reading, woman dies in Georgia because of a pro-life law. When if they read farther, they would realize, oh, she actually died because she had complications from taking the abortion pill. So anyway, people are not necessarily very informed on exactly, the details of state law or how it's actually playing out in specific situations. So that's leading to a lot of backlash, I think, against these pro-life laws. And I was talking to a guy in Ohio a couple months ago just about his, he was involved in the Protect Women Ohio group that opposed last year's pro-abortion amendment in the state. And I was asking him in hindsight, what would you have done differently if you could have? What are some things you learned through that? And he basically said, when given the option between abortion legal for any reason or no abortion, people are going to pick abortion legal for any reason because they're worried about those exceptions, those complicated in between situations like, rape and incest. I mean, I think most pro-life groups would say even that is not, that's, that baby is still a human. We should not allow for abortions in cases of rape and incest. But I think some people in our culture, they just don't know what to think of it. They haven't, they think that in some ways the mom's life or her autonomy matters more than the life of that baby. So why would you make her give birth? But that's the mentality that we're seeing play out in these elections and the passage of all these pro-life amendments or the pro-abortion amendments. I just don't know. I wonder if going back to your question, I'm rambling again, but going back to your question, I wonder if like the abortion issue is kind of an indicator of where the culture is going in other issues as well.
Absolutely.
So that's another argument against like backing off and focusing on these other issues, because it almost seems like it's just fundamental to any sort of culture that's going to abide by just the truth, It starts with the abortion issue, and definitely there are similar problems with like the transgenderism issue and things like that. But it all goes back to that question of autonomy, and in no other cultural issue does it affect someone else so much as with abortion, because it's literally ending the lives of people. I mean, like you were saying, maybe people are dying from transgender surgeries,
but not at the rate, not 3,000 a day or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's just different. It's like a different scope in a way. So I don't even know if that answered your question, but
no, that's fine. Cause I think it's interesting. Well, I think this is because I guess, so I think there's two realms that people should probably think about as they think about the abortion issue, because you obviously have the political realm. And I think that a lot of people don't have a good political philosophy. I mean, I tend to take on the perspective of like the principles of subsidiarity, in which I have the primary responsibility that I have in my life is to God and to obey God. And then, you go one circle out from that is to my wife, and then one circle out my family, one circle out my church, one circle out it's the state government, and then the federal government. And so there's a sense in which that's how I should care about these things. And also, like, I should care about my relationship with God first, then my wife, then my family. But then there's also a sense in which those sorts of institutions on the fringes, the federal government, state government, and then the local church, should be less involved in my personal life on the basis of how far away they are. And the federal government should support the federal government should support the state should support the local church. So it should kind of like support the one that's further in from itself. Okay. So if I think that way, I think that that's the best way of thinking about just what we have responsibility toward. Then I think that you have to think about the abortion issue in kind of two different realms. So you have the political realm, and at the federal level, like how can the federal level support the state level and then the local church and then me personally and my family. And I would say that there's a multitude of ways that it can do that. One is by a full-on federal abortion ban, which would be amazing. But I don't think that that's going to happen at the current time. But one could be just like, don't tax me, like stop taxing me so I can give my money to like pro-life, because there are good things happening at pro-life pregnancy clinics. You know, they're saving women and children's lives. Even if it's just 100 or 200, you know, in a year, that's an amazing thing. And we should give all of our money to that because saving one baby is a good thing. But not taxing me so I can give my money to people who are actually doing the good work and do it myself would be an amazing thing. And I think that then you have the church realm, the local church. And I think that's where people should be like more intense, more hardcore on their pastors and on their churches. I mean, like, I want to know, you talked about how the pro-life movement had a lot less money than the pro-abortion movement. And I want to actually look at like the top denominations or even the non-denominational churches across the country and see how much money they were bringing in the last year and if there's any way, I mean, this would be a difficult project, but if there's any way in which you could figure out where the money was spent and what percentage of that money was spent going toward pro-life things, because I think that's a direct violation of scripture in like a million different ways in which we need to take care of the poor and the widow. And so like, that's important. And so I feel like what I've noticed, and you can tell me if you've seen differently, I feel like the Christians that are pro-life care more about what's happening at the federal level and less about, they don't want to go and confront their pastor and talk to people in their church about the issue at the local level. But I think that's backwards. So I think people should just like vote for the best candidate. So Trump obviously is not a Christian. He's like obviously secular, but he's going to be better economically. He's going to be a little bit more pro-life. And so we vote for him, and then go very hard on our pastors and on our churches and figure out where that money is going and figure out how we're supporting things. I know that's kind of a philosophical, theological question, but do you see any flaws in that? I guess I've been trying to think through this for a little while, but what do you think about that?
That makes sense to me. I guess I would say though, it could start even more, because you're giving like those different realms. I think it could start even closer to home instead of even just with pastors. I mean, I think that's important, but
sure,
even with your own children, with yourself, like
that's good.
Being pregnant was, it really exposed in me some selfishness that reminded me a lot of like reasons I've heard people give for, why they would want an abortion. Not saying that I was like considering an abortion. I'm just saying that I noticed selfishness in my heart that I also notice in just the general culture that's very pro-abortion. So for instance, like, someone might get an abortion because it's just not the right time for them to have a kid. Like they want to get settled in their career more. They're financially kind of strapped and those sound like, okay, she wants to be a responsible mom. Right. So why not get an abortion? Well, fundamentally, again, going back to what I was saying before, when you're making a decision like that, you're putting your own opinions and your own view of your life and what you think is best for yourself above what God actually says in his word. And we just on a day-to-day level, how often do you and I do that, where we assume this is better for me. I know this is not what God's word says, such as like, do not grumble or complain, even something that seems so little, that is still like a rebellion against what God says, just as abortion is. And I think that's something that we need to be, as parents, telling our kids, like pointing out to them ways in which they're trying to put their own view of what's best above what God says. Times when they're acting as if they are God, instead of submitting to God. the one who has authority over their lives. So, so I think it would be great to call out pastors, of course, like in a respectful way. But I think more fundamentally, like, what are we teaching our own children? Yeah. Are we preaching the gospel to ourselves too? Like, that's kind of where it starts is in our own hearts. So
yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned, you just said, you've noticed certain selfish things about yourself when you were pregnant. When my wife got pregnant, it was weird for me as a guy who has never been pregnant. I know you have to say that nowadays. As a guy who has never been pregnant, who doesn't know how the female brain works and and what's happening in the body. Like my wife said to me at one point, she was like, I could totally see why a woman can justify an abortion in their mind when you're pregnant, because there's just a million things running through your head. And if she would never consider getting an abortion or anything like that, she just, I could see how that could happen, because you're highly emotional, and emotions are, in some ways, you're fighting for your emotions not to govern what is morally right and good and true, because emotions are very strong things. And if your emotions aren't governed by morality, then your morality is going to be governed by your emotions. And so that is, I mean, you're the second woman behind my wife that I've heard say that they're like, things are happening in your mind. You're like, what in the world is going on? And I've noticed that the abortion issue, and it's interesting that you brought up the language of responsibility, or people say, well, they're trying to be responsible. It's not the right time to have a baby. You need to have more money and a bigger house. And it's like, these are actually, one, for Christians, all rooted, I think, in greed and the idea that, like, Americans, sort of lifestyle and the standard of living is wildly greedy, and it's totally out of proportion for most people with what's actually biblical. And so the idea that you need like a 5-bedroom house and like a $500,000 home with like 2 really nice cars, it's just a complete lie. Like, that's actually not true at all. And also the idea that the material thing is more important than the actual human being inside of you is just, it's like the most evil philosophy you could have, the materialistic philosophy. That doesn't make any sense. It's not Christian. The other issue is that it completely lacks faith. I mean, the Bible, Christ is clear that God will take care of his children. Yeah. He will give you what you need. And so if you're doing the right thing, first by like having sex with your spouse within a marriage, and trying to have kids, that's good. That's all being obedient to Christ. When you're being obedient to him, he will take care of you, even if you don't understand how that's going to happen. So even if you say how the finances are going to work, things like that, we've noticed, like, we're not rich. We don't have a lot of money, but we've noticed the more kids we have, just the more God has provided for us in certain ways. And so we're just like, we're just gonna keep doing the right thing. And even if we were homeless, I'd still be like, no, we're going to have kids because kids are good. And we'll figure out, God will take care of us at some point. Like, we'll figure it out. But I think people have a complete lack of faith. They don't actually think God takes care of them, and they're utilitarian and pragmatic. Yeah. And they don't care about obeying the statutes of God. And that's a problem. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Going back to what you were saying about, like what your wife was saying during pregnancy. For me, it was issues like, well, I'm not fitting in my old clothes anymore, and I can't like eat XYZ. And, so I think people, those are some probably reasons why some people get abortions. Like, oh, well, I'm not going to look good, in my bikini or something during spring break. Right. I'm sure that's a reason for somebody. But like, as far as like pregnancy, it does, it messes a lot with like hormonally with you. But I think also what's interesting is that in some ways it's just bringing out what's already there, like it's just exposing it. For me, it was just exposing certain areas of selfishness that I really hadn't thought much about before, because I never had another human inside of me that literally what I ate was going to affect him. So I think that's an important kind of mentality to have, especially as we're counseling. I think Christians should be wanting to counsel women who are facing these unplanned pregnancies. And I think one of the most important things is to help them recognize, you're not just a product of your environment. Like there is something inside of you that needs to be dealt with. Just like with all of us, we all have heart issues that require repentance and turning to the Lord. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm just like this because I'm stressed, I have like a hard life. No, like there's obviously past histories, things that can contribute to where we are today as a person. But to blame it on that's kind of restricting. Like it prevents you from really finding freedom from those things. And Christ promises freedom in him. So anyway, so that's just one other thing. And I guess I'm talking about this because I thought a lot about, if someone's at a crisis pregnancy center and they're counseling a woman who faces unplanned pregnancies, some pro-life pregnancy centers I've interviewed for like articles I've worked on, sometimes they're afraid to talk about the issue of like the gospel or talk about abortion as wrong. Like they don't want to offend somebody, but I think I understand you don't want to offend someone, you want to help them. But I think you need to make sure that you are having those conversations, addressing heart issues, because that is like the most street level it gets, just the heart problems inside of all of us. That's where all of this starts, all of the results of these abortion amendments this week. It all starts with a heart issue. So,
No, that's you have to be a Christian. Jesus proclaimed the truth no matter where he was. And like I read through the Gospels, I went to a church for a while and I would say things. I did this podcast for a long time with a pastor who's now gone off the rails, totally liberal, he doesn't believe the truth anymore and doesn't advocate for the truth anymore. And, but it was a conservative church for a long time. And so him and I did this podcast and I would say things just intensely about things like abortion. Because I think you need to be intense toward that, and not like you need to like scream at women about that. But anyway, take it seriously. And I had this one lady who was a Democrat who went to the church. She worked for the Democrat Party. She wanted to meet with me and talk to me about my rhetoric, which I was already like, okay, that's ridiculous, but I'll do it. And so I went and met with her and she was just like, don't you ever read the Gospels? Can't you see how Jesus doesn't talk like this? He's not mean like this. And I was like, fine, lady, I will go back and read through the 4 Gospels and if I'm wrong, because I heard this rhetoric all the time in Madison, because everybody's a liberal. They're just like, Jesus is so kind and he never says anything mean to anybody. He's always nice. It's like, they murdered him because he was so nice that they just wanted to get rid of him. But that was, so I went back and I read through the Gospels. I'm like, no, I realized afterwards, he's way more intense, way more hardcore than I even thought he was to begin with. His language around certain things, about leading children astray, which is abortion. He says it'd be better if somebody were to tie a millstone around your neck and throw you into the sea than for you to do that. That's his language. That's Jesus's rhetoric. When he talks to Pharisees and heretics, he calls them sons of hell, whitewashed tombs. He calls people fools. When he talks about to the woman who has had multiple husbands, he calls her immediately to repent. When he talks to the rich young ruler, he calls out his exact sin that he needs to repent of. And that's what he does to people. He doesn't care about offending people. And that's why they murdered him. And as Christians, our job is to be like Christ. And so like, as far as like the kind of utilitarian, strategizing, how can we say the thing to get the person to do what we want? It's like, that's actually not the Christian's job at all. Our job is to proclaim the truth and allow for the Holy Spirit to work in people's hearts and to change them. We can't change them. And that sort of ideology of like creating little methods that aren't the same as what Jesus did, it sends people to hell feeling like they're moral, and that doesn't work. And so that, I guess that's the first thing I thought when you're saying like Christians need to tell the truth. That's like what we do as Christians. The other thing is, I think you're totally right. Like when you follow the commands of Christ, you said like you realize kind of some of the bad things about yourself while being pregnant, like even, getting married. A lot of people don't want to get married anymore. I think one of the reasons they don't want to get married is young people don't want to get married and they're waiting till they're like 35 or 40 to get married is because like when you get married, you realize you're just a scumbag. Like it's like I'm just a terrible scumbag, and I'm selfish. I don't care about anybody, and my wife thinks I'm a terrible scumbag sometimes, and like I think she's a terrible. So you realize these things because you're following Christ, and I think a lot of young people have decided I'm just not going to do that. I'm just going to not get married. I'm just going to not have kids, and there are repercussions for that later on in life, but. The idea that you're just not going to have kids and you're just not going to get married so you don't ever have to deal with your problems, like that actually doesn't work over the long run. I mean, you're going to have to deal with them at a certain point. One thing, Jordan Peterson probably.
Yes, roughly. Yeah.
One thing that he says that's interesting is as he's done counseling and therapy for married couples for a long time, he said every divorce he's seen is like 10, 20,000 small arguments that were never had. And so all culminating in divorce. And I think that's the case for any sort of catastrophe that people go through in their life. It's like whatever catastrophe that you have later on in life, that's a result of you abdicating your responsibility and not actually caring about the things that God told you were sin or things like that, or not doing the things that God said. These are just like basic biblical principles. And it's crazy to me that we have to say this stuff on a podcast, or even people have to talk about this. Like what you're saying, where you're like, I know you don't want to offend people, but it's like, what do you, what do you mean? Like, I don't necessarily want to offend people, but that's just what you do. It's just part of the Christian DNA. Like, do you think that the rhetoric, are you finding that to be the case across the board, across the country, where a lot of these pro-life people are afraid of just proclaiming the truth and just saying, this is the truth, I don't care what you think?
Well, I think for pregnancy centers specifically, they're in a very sensitive kind of field, I guess, where
a lot of emotions.
Yeah. Like their goal largely is to help a mom avoid an abortion. So the concern is if we offend them, maybe they'll get an abortion and then we failed, So, and that's complicated, it's because, some other pregnancy centers, they also have a focus of, we want to make sure women hear the gospel. So they kind of have a dual goal. But I do think there are more pregnancy centers than people probably expect that have taken a very secular approach. And for the sake of saving lives, which, then in that case, but you might be saving, helping a woman save her baby's life, but what about her eternal life?
That's exactly what
like that's
I was gonna say. I mean, because that's the problem.
Yeah. And I mean,
go ahead.
Like even groups like Students for Life, so like a very influential pro-life organization. Like I know that they often are trying to avoid spiritual arguments because they want to focus on the science. They want to focus on, getting people to that point, showing them that, you can be pro-life even if you're not a Christian. But if you're a Christian who is pro-life, really the most important thing is the gospel. So you can't can't be like disavowing that for the sake of changing people's minds. But I do understand it's like it's a difficult tension. No.
I get that. And I'm going to push back a little bit on certain things, but I think one of the things you can't have you can't convince people into rationally understanding why it's wrong to murder a human being. Like if somebody thinks that it's wrong. So you go to G.K. Chesterton kind of talked about like the most logical people in the world are the people who are in the insane asylums. Cause you'll go and talk to the people in the insane asylums and they're running logical circles. They just have this idea in their head that they're running circles around. Of course, those ideas that they're thinking, I mean, they're insane and they're illogical, but they've created kind of this logical sort of reason, which isn't actually reason, argument in their head. So they have airtight arguments, but they're crazy and all their presuppositions are wrong and they don't believe in fundamental truths. And so therefore it's actually irrational and unreasonable and illogical. And so, And so one of the things, I think one of the reasons why pro-life people have kind of lost the cultural battle is because they're trying to do just that. Let's have a scientific debate. It's like, this isn't a scientific conversation. You don't get to tell me that a human being is a human being when it has a heartbeat. You just arbitrarily made that up off the top of your head. It doesn't make sense. And you don't say that about anything else. So this isn't logic. This isn't reason. We're not actually having an argument here. Now we're just saying fun things. And it's like, I guess we could do that, but it's not really, I don't think it's very helpful for people.
Yeah.
I do think, and maybe it's just my temperament and personality, although I don't think so. I think it's actually in the Bible, but I don't actually agree that it's as complicated. I'm just pushing back a little bit because I get why you're saying that it's complicated. I don't think it's complicated. Like, I think the Holy Spirit, I look back to, and I hope I don't botch this. It's not Elijah. It's not Elijah in the Old Testament. You know, the dead bones.
Is that Ezekiel?
Ezekiel, thank you. In an earlier podcast, I said Elijah, and my wife was like, that is not what it is. So Ezekiel, okay, so Ezekiel is in the valley of, dry bones. These bones are dead. There's nothing that can bring them back to life except for the prophecy, the specific prophecy that God gives Ezekiel to speak upon those bones, and then they're brought to life. They put flesh back on them. I mean, that's a type of evangelism. That's an Old Testament typology. You're looking forward now to the New Testament, and if we want to create a methodology around how to save people's life and bring dead people to life, do that. You take the specific prophecy of what Christ put forward in the scriptures and you speak that, you proclaim it, and you allow for the work of the truth of the word and the spirit to do the work of bringing flesh to the dead bones. It's not the job of the human being to try to rationally think through whether or not this is going to work. I mean, because that's actually never been the Christian belief. That the faith has never been, is this going to work? Like when Jesus goes and calls the 12 disciples, he's like, hey, come and follow me. And they're like, well, I need to create a spreadsheet and figure out whether or not this is going to work. They didn't do that. They're just like, I'm just going to go follow him because I think this is true. And it's totally irrational. It makes no sense to the average person. Everybody's probably, I don't want to add to scripture, but I would assume people were probably like, are you sure you don't want to think through this before you go and follow some random guy who's calling himself God? Like, you sure you want to do this? They're like, there's a faith aspect to it. So I guess just to push back, I would say, I think Americans have become way too focused on figuring out what is pragmatic, what is diplomatic, how you can politically say something. And it's not that. We just need to proclaim the truth and then pray and allow for the Holy Spirit to do what it's going to do. But if people say, hey, like, screw you, I'm not listening to you because you offended me, I don't think that any sort of man-made language structures and methodologies is actually going to change that person's mind. And to your point, and then I'll shut up, is that you're right. Like, the primary focus should be people getting saved, to know who Christ is, to become Christians. And we do want to save the baby, but ultimately the spiritual world is more real than the physical world that we live in. And so for people to just, my mom, I know I said I'd shut up, but this is all part of a larger point. My mom, 27 years ago, grew up in a Catholic family, was not a Christian, 19 years old, goes to college and major partier. And she gets pregnant by a cocaine addict, right, at 19. And she's like, hey, I'm going to have an abortion. And her roommate, who she partied with all the time, her roommate was like, hey, before you have this abortion, can you just talk to my mom about this? And mom was like, okay, whatever. And my mom went in to talk to this lady's mom. It turns out this lady works for CareNet Pregnancy Centers, which is the Christian pregnancy center in Madison. And this lady just showed my mom a video of what an actual abortion is and preached the gospel to her. My mom became a Christian. My brother was saved, and he's still alive and married. So,
wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's great. It's amazing. But that is because a woman had courage to tell the truth. She didn't pontificate and equivocate and say, "Yeah, this is really." She's just like, "No, Carrie, my mom. This is what happens when you have an abortion. You're murdering a kid. Okay, you need to believe in Jesus and repent." And my mom was like, "Okay." She saw the video and she's like, I'm not aborting my kid. That is not happening, because most women don't actually know. And then she became a Christian. Nowadays, like, if I go to a church and say that that's what our method should be, people will be like, no, we can't do that. That won't work. People are going to get offended and they're going to leave.
Yes. Yes.
Who cares? It's not my job. Like if they're going to face God in judgment and he's going to be like, I told you, I sent somebody to tell you and you rejected me. And Christ says, if they reject you, they reject me. Mm-hmm. And so then move on. Yeah. But I actually think that if we did tell the truth, we would see incredibly amazing statistics. I actually think their lives would change, but the Christian church for the last 50 years has just been pontificating nonsense and equivocating biblical passages and trying to be culturally relevant. And you're not culturally relevant if you're a Christian. People are going to hate you. Sorry, that was 20 minutes of things, but do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Well, actually what you're saying reminds me, I don't know if you're familiar with the abortion abolitionists. Have you heard of them?
No, but it sounds intense. But yeah.
It is intense. So they have many of them will not even identify as pro-life. They will try to make a distinction between themselves and the mainstream pro-life movement because they are frustrated with exactly what you're saying, that the pro-life movement has become too pragmatic, using worldly. This is what they would say, that they're using worldly methods to try to end abortion in the country. Yeah. When abolitionists will largely argue that we need to follow what God has to say, use his I don't know if strategy is the right word, but do it the way he would do it, not the way the world would do it. And they critique pro-lifers for being too pragmatic in that way. So, so that's really interesting, is to see their arguments about the abortion issue, and how many, if you go to any abortion facility in the country and talk to the I don't even know if they would always call themselves pro-life, but talk to the anti-abortion people outside of the abortion facility who are maybe preaching the gospel to the women walking in, or, offering materials. Often there are, just pro-life organizations that are doing it more of trying to be friendly and say, hey, we're here for you. Here's some materials. We'd love to give you a free ultrasound or something. But then the people there who are preaching the gospel outside of the abortion facility, from my experience, those people tend to be abortion abolitionists. So they're the people that would argue that we can't just try to be pragmatic. Obviously they would still offer material help. There are some here I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. There are some at our local Planned Parenthood, and some abolitionists who throw not birthday parties, but baby showers for women who decide not to get abortions after hearing the gospel being preached outside of the abortion facility. So they're obviously interested in helping these women on a practical level, but their initial goal is to make sure that they hear the truth, the truth of God's word. And so that's how they kind of approach these women. And I think, I'm all for preaching the gospel. Even outside of an abortion facility, I know pro-lifers will say, other pro-lifers will say, oh, that's offensive. It makes, women offended as they're walking in. It makes them angry. Well, I mean, if they're offended and angry, it's probably because they're feeling convicted about what they're doing. So, I'll
just make the point also that people who would make those sorts of arguments would have been on the side of the slave owners. There's absolutely no doubt of it. They're if you tell the slave owners to stop having slaves, they're going to be offended. It's that's why we're saying it, because we want them to understand there's a problem with it. I mean, there's a serious issue in the Christian, evangelical, non-denominational Christian church. I just think I've seen statistics from the election that evangelicals didn't really show up at all for Republicans, for Trump especially, but they didn't really vote. They did third party, which I think is passive and indicative of the preaching and of the teaching across non-denominational evangelical churches today. But and I can fact check and see if that statistic is legit, but I've seen it several times over the past couple of days that they just didn't really show up. And I think it's because, I just think it's indicative of exactly the things that we're talking about. But I read recently a book on Spurgeon, Charles Spurgeon, and then I interviewed the author, Alex DePrima. And there's a section in that book in which Spurgeon is living in the time in which slavery has been abolished in England and it hasn't been in the United States. And he hates slavery. And his sermons were being spread all over the world. And so the New York Times at the time would actually put his sermons in the New York Times, which is like insane to even say that today because they would never do anything like that now.
I can't imagine.
But right. Yeah, that would never happen. But the New York Times, I mean, millions of people every week were hearing his sermons because they were written out and then they'd be put in newspapers in China and all over the place. So, and he would speak about the slavery problem in America and he would say some pretty intense things. And the New York Times started cutting out all of the things that he said about slavery. Mm-hmm. And he said, then you're not allowed to publish my sermons anymore. And he lost a ton of money off of that, but he was just like, no, you can't change my words. And then he went harder on his sermons about this. And he ended, there's a quote, and maybe I'll find it in the book and put it somewhere on this podcast, but where he essentially is like, it's super, I remember I read it, I like had to reread it. And he is basically like, well, maybe the Americans will learn about the terrible realities of slavery, by the point of a bayonet or by the bullet or something. Like he basically, I mean, he did in the quote call for civil war and call for bloodshed over slavery. And of course, Spurgeon is in my opinion, one of the best pastors, Prince of Preachers. He's one of the greatest preachers of all time, very convicted person, has a great theological outlook. And he's calling for civil war because of slavery. Okay. Now this is where I don't want people to take this all the wrong way, but I think slavery is not as bad as abortion at all. I think killing babies is way worse. And I think that any theologian worth their salt, so anybody like Jonathan Edwards, although, let's just say Jonathan Edwards, and you have people like obviously Spurgeon and even some of the more recent theologians, I think like J.I. Packer and things like that, like their convictions were very, very clear on abortion. And I'm not saying they'd all call for civil war, but the fact that like a very prominent, very good theological force and pastoral force in the church history called for a civil war on the basis of slavery, which is just objectively not as bad as abortion, I think speaks to the fact that Christians need to be a little bit, just maybe a little bit, probably intense. A little bit more intense on this. I mean, your statistics, your reporting is showing that whatever we're doing just isn't working across the board. And maybe like being passive, pragmatic millennials, which, I think millennials are kind of the forefront of that, isn't actually going to work. Maybe just telling the truth to people might work a little bit better.
Sure.
I would love to try it, see what happens.
Yeah. Well, that's what abortion abolitionists are doing. They're trying it. So
do you think it's working?
Well, I feel like compared to the pro-life movement, they're relatively young as far as not necessarily the people in it, but like how long they've been around. Obviously, there's always been disagreements among pro-lifers about should we do this incrementally or should we do this, all out, like, push for more like stronger protections for babies. Like there's always been disagreement about that. But as far as like approaching it from, like getting rid of the idea of, and maybe there's something in history of the pro-life movement that I just don't know about. So maybe I'm inaccurate about this, but from what I've observed, that idea of like, no, let's not try to just go through, practical, pragmatic means. Let's push for what Scripture says and push for laws that would include like, punishments for women who get abortions because they're seen as being a part, of that decision to get an abortion. That's part of the abolitionist view. Sure. I mean, they haven't passed any laws yet. Like they haven't been successful at getting their bills passed through any legislature. So
yeah,
I think,
that doesn't seem.
Sorry, what was that?
I was just thinking, punishing the women. Like, I think the women need to be confronted on their sin, but I do think that there's an order of operations even biblically. I think that the way that the apostles and the way that Jesus talks to people who are leading people astray is different than he talks to congregants or just your average Christian. And so the idea that you're going to punish, I think if you went after the abortionists and you wanted to prosecute them, I think that would be great. Put them in prison. I think they're some of the worst people in the country. But the women who have been propaganda, I mean, they're hearing propaganda. They're being told, lies constantly. I think there needs to be some level of grace while we call them to repentance kind of on the local personal levels. But I'm not necessarily sure that if the abolitionist movement is saying that we should put these women in prison, I guess I just don't even know. I just don't know why you would say that. I don't think that they're the people that are necessarily, I think they're victims in a lot of ways in this. And I'm not a victim type of person, but when you're being told by every institution in the country that you're just getting rid of a couple cells in your body, I think some people genuinely believe that. And I think that that's the abortionist fault and the Planned Parenthood's fault. And I think we should take the big institutional people out. And then I think that the cultural imaginary would start to shift and change because you'd have new information. Same with Elon Musk buying Twitter. And I think that affected the election because I think people just had more information. They're like, oh, okay. We know about some of the issues on the Harris Walls campaign, and it can't just be shut down by the institution. So I guess I would probably push back on those people.
Sure.
With I guess this just doesn't make any sense why you're attacking the women on that.
Well, it wouldn't be. So from my understanding from speaking with them, their approach is, they wouldn't retroactively put any woman who's had an abortion in jail. That's not, that's not their intent. It would be moving forward from when a law is passed.
Okay.
But I've talked to them about this. I'm like, so wait, what about those difficult situations where a woman actually is kind of forced into getting an abortion? And
right.
their approach is well, the goal is to classify abortion as homicide. So, in a homicide case, someone can argue for necessity, for instance, someone else, they were being attacked, so that's why they killed so-and-so, or coercion, someone made me kill this person, so those arguments would apply. That's their argument. But they have also made the point that, well, if if it's legal for moms to get abortions, or if there's no punishment for a mom who gets an abortion, how are we ever going to end, abortion pills pouring into pro-life states like Texas? Yeah. I don't know if you've seen the statistics on this, but it is definitely a conundrum for the pro-life movement as a whole. Yeah. Women are still getting abortions in states like Texas and Mississippi, really any state that has a strong pro-life law protecting babies. Yeah. I've talked to the people involved with legislation, and they don't really know exactly what to do about it. So the abolitionist solution is, well, we need to have some sort of penalty for the mom who gets an abortion.
I could see.
Yeah. Okay. So it is I see you're thinking through. I'm this is what I've been thinking through for, right. for months and months. But it's difficult to really find a solution to that issue. And they would also say, if we believe abortion is killing an innocent human being, then we need to treat it in that way. This is what the abolitionists would say. And that would teach, having some sort of penalty would also be a deterrent to prevent moms from doing it in the first place. And they have women who are a part of their movement who are I had an abortion in the past. If it had been illegal for me to do it, I wouldn't have done it. So
right.
yeah, so there are all these these arguments about like how exactly to approach this. And yeah, I think from my spot as like a reporter, listening to all these different people having, this is how I would do it, this is my approach. It's a lot to think through, Yeah, it is. But I think that's why the fundamental issue is approaching it from a gospel perspective. Like, that's the thing that I've formed the strongest conviction on through my reporting. Just how important it is to make sure you're not leaving the gospel out of these conversations when it comes to the abortion issue. It's not just philosophical. It's not just scientific. Like, this is a heart problem and a gospel issue.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. No, that's good. And I actually think that, so there's the laws and there's the question of law and what's going to be put into law. And that's things that we need to figure out and figure out what we're going to put forward and what options are we going to put forward and what should we vote for. Granted, when you get down to it, when people are actually voting on things, it's usually like there's a pro-abortion thing and then there's a thing that's not so pro-abortion, like that was the case. And so in those cases, you got two choices. And as a Christians, you make the better choice, and so in that case, it becomes less complicated. Now on the back end of all that, where you're trying to figure out what are those choices, that's where things get a little bit more difficult. That said, kind of in some ways separating the two realms of the church and the state, not because I think that there should be a full separation, but when you're in the local church and when we're just operating as normal Christians on an everyday basis, you would agree that the rhetoric around this needs to be just like you're saying, share the gospel, tell the truth.
Yeah.
Because I do think that there's a way in which those two worlds, they collide, and you have to operate out of a Christian conviction, no matter what world you're in. If you're making policy or whatever, you have to operate out of those two, your Christian conviction. But in the local church and functioning as a Christian in your everyday life, you cannot not tell the truth. Yeah. Otherwise you're a liar. And that's the problem. You need to repent. So yeah. Okay. We have to wrap this up or I'm going to be late, but cause I had a bunch more questions about like the future of the pro-life movement.
Oh, sure. Yes.
So that's fine. No, cause I think all of what we talked about is really good. And I hope that this starts getting people to think even more about this. We should maybe do a future podcast on, if you want to, sure, on like the future of the pro-life movement and things like that, because I don't see, like we're talking about, it feels like there's factions and people are like, okay, here's what we should do. Here's what we should do. And I want to know, there's two questions. What's the right thing to do? And then how do you make that work? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work. I don't care about the how you make it work thing as much, but just like, what's the right thing to do, I think should be the question. So anyways, I appreciate you doing this, and I appreciate you writing and doing the reporting on this, because not a lot of news companies are actually doing that because they don't want to know the truth about abortion and what's actually happening. So I appreciate that. Yeah. And thanks for coming on. I know we had to stop the conversation like abruptly, but in like 15 minutes, I've got the other interview. So yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for
having
me.
Anyways, yeah, thanks so much.